It is great to be back for another episode. This one is on competence-based competition, and we are joined once again by our guest, Gary Hamel. Welcome back to the show.
Yeah, nice to see you again, Aidan. Happy to be back.
Gary's just back after some extensive travels throughout China in the provinces, so he's tired, and I'm I'm very grateful to have you back with us. We're going to cover this, right? So I want to explain this book. This book is a very interesting concept. Gary and Ame Heen both invited academics to contribute, to challenge, to build upon this article that they wrote back in 1990, published in 1990, probably written for many years before that. Gary, maybe you'll give us some context on that. But this book is really interesting because it was an invite to the academic community who are often battling over what is strategy, is it emergent, is it designed, etc., etc. What do you think? And it was an invitation and beautiful idea. So we're really going to focus on Gary's and CK's work on core competence and core competencies being the competitive advantage. And bear in mind, this is several decades ago. So this work back then still hasn't seen the light of day in many, many companies. So I am very, very grateful to be putting a spotlight on this brilliant work.
Yeah, well, as you say, Aidan, a long time ago, and I can tell you a little bit about how these ideas came to be and perhaps a little bit about the context. I think the work first showed up as an article in the Harvard Business Review. And it was interesting in those days, maybe it still does. The Harvard Business Review ran, they had this jury every year to choose the best articles. They call it the McKinsey Award, I guess, sponsored by McKinsey and Company, the consulting company. And CKI won that several times. I think our competence came second that year, but probably is one of the more enduring pieces that we've written. The prominence is, let me try to go back into that time frame. Strategy and marketing had almost converged at that point. Most of the conversation about strategy was really about what products are you going to sell? How are they positioned in the marketplace? What brands do you control? But strategy was very, very much product focused. And we thought, well, that certainly makes sense. But we wondered if there was a deeper element to strategy, which is really focused on building deep skills that you could apply across multiple businesses over time. And that was just pretty much ignored. There was here and there a little bit of academic work called big clumsy phrase called the resource based view of the firm, which like is a good way of thinking about firms. What are the resources you have? So there was that current out there, I guess, in the academic world, but certainly not much attention in the corporate world. And again, this was against the backdrop of increasing international competition writing from the United States at that time. And I think CK and I almost came to this idea in parallel. We were both working with different companies. He was working with some big telecommunications companies. At that time, I was working with a company that I believe still exists, Carrier. They were a leader in air conditioning. And they were facing a decision on whether they outsourced some part of their compressors, which is at the heart of a air conditioner refrigeration, whether they outsourced that, I can't remember, to some foreign company. Well, we'd already seen this little movie play out where a lot of American companies in consumer electronics had outsourced production of televisions to, at that time, Japanese companies, perhaps Toshiba, Panasonic, and others, who were white label, you'd call it OEM suppliers of televisions. And that started with very simple black and white televisions where their margins probably weren't very high. But of course, these companies were eager to learn and eager to establish their own presence around the world. And so in becoming manufacturers, they mastered the art of making at that time cathode ray tubes and doing them very efficiently with very high quality. And of course, weren't content to just sit at the front end of the supply chain. They began to build their own brands and to come around the market. And I thought this is likely to play out in a lot of industries, right? If long term you don't control the underlying technologies, the skills that provide the differentiation in your product, that's a disadvantage, right? Ultimately, brands are not enough or often are not enough to protect you, particularly when you have hungry companies that are eager to build their own global brands. So I was thinking about that, and I'm sure the advice I provided at the time was like, don't do this. I can't remember whether they did or not, but it was clear this is probably not a great idea, and you are going to lose control over critical technology and therefore over over your destiny. Now, I'll skip forward a little bit. I think some people, and maybe perhaps rightly so, have criticized the idea of core competence because they almost flipped our original argument on its head and said, this is an excuse to outsource anything that's not really core. And originally, we were writing the article as a warning, don't lose control over what is core. But if you are interested in lowering costs and not making big investments and having an easy life, it was very tempting to say, let somebody else do this. And our core will be something else. But the dilemma with that, with offshoring outsourcing in general, which again, none of these things can be on a simple rule, but one of the risks you take is whatever you offshore, whatever you outsource will perhaps never again be a source of competitive advantage for you. Because now you're buying a service or a component or whatever it may be from somebody who's probably providing that to your competitors. And once you get off that train of development, once you're no longer building and developing that competence, very hard if somebody else is learning fast and gaining scale and so on, very hard to get off and walk and then find that train still there to reboard. So I think some companies probably, as I, again, bastardize the concept, use it in a very simplistic way as an excuse. Gee, let's get rid of anything that's not core. And we were really writing it to say, hey, be very careful about offshoring outsourcing. So that was a bit of the providence. So let me stop there and then we can go a little deeper. But that's where the idea came from. And recognizing that over in the short term, day to day, yes, about what brand, what product, what features in the marketplace. But if you think of competition over 3, 4, 5, 10-year time frame, it's much more about who's building really deep skills that provide a lot of differentiation and that the skills that are very difficult to replicate. And you want to make sure that somewhere you're making those investments and you're building that deep capability.
Brilliant, brilliant context. And I just want to remind our audience that I'm probably torturing Gary a bit, bringing him back to all this working. It's years ago that you wrote this stuff, and you're in a certain frame of mind. I thought it was so funny when Gary and I were planning the next book. He's like, I guess we'll be doing leading the revolution, which we will cover in the future. And I was like, oh no, 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 there's another one in between. He's like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. So when you forget about a book that you read, that's a good sign that you've created a lot of great content out there. And you probably don't remember this, but there's a beautiful foreword written by Rummelt, and he said the idea of core competencies, as introduced by Prahalad and Hamel in 1990, has generated enormous interest. When it appeared, both academics and corporate managers sensed that this idea was important. There was an immediate and unusually broad resonance within these communities, the communities of strategic thinking. This resonance owed much to Prahlad and Hamel's craft of persuasiveness, but it also drew on the audience's readiness for the message. After decades of seeing corporate strategy treated as a portfolio problem, academics and practitioners were ripe for a view of corporate strategy that placed technology, skill, and synergy ahead of cash flow and control. Beautifully written, beautiful way to tee us up to talk about that challenge that up until then, corporate strategy had placed the very visible things, technology, skill, and synergy ahead of that cash flow and control. And I don't know if you remember this, but there's a beautiful metaphor that you use of a tree and the concept of the tree that as a corporate manager, you focus on the very visible aspects, the leaves and the branches, but it's actually the roots, and the roots is where the core competencies is built. Over to you.
Yeah, I think that is, and by the way, Dick was very thoughtful to write that, and one of the great strategic thinkers for sure. I mean, it's interesting. So often, you know, a great idea is not always great in some deep intellectual respect, but just happens to be the right idea at the right time. And I think core competence was an enduring idea, but it was definitely the right idea at the right time. And yeah, corporate strategy become quite mechanical. uh, Unless you're a student of strategy, you might not remember kind of Boston Consulting Group and this kind of portfolio view. And I'll probably not even remember exactly the theory, but basically you looked at a portfolio of businesses by whether it was a cash cow and throwing out a mature business with perhaps not much growth left, or whether I guess they called it a star, which is both growing and very profitable. And then you had dogs that were neither growing nor profitable. And it was largely about making those portfolio decisions. What do we keep? What do we dispose of? And that seemed in one sense sensible, but also wrong to me because I don't believe there are very many businesses where you can look at a point in time and say, this is forever going to be a low growth business, or there's no way to gain any market share here. And so it was a very static view of industries and of businesses as things that were either mature or not, or profitable or not. And you've seen a lot of companies that have taken mature businesses and reinvented them, revived them, brought new thinking to them. So it seemed to us a kind of fairly simplistic, static way of thinking about strategy. And we knew there was something deeper here. The other thing that probably got lost over time, at least I haven't thought about a long time, is we actually thought of a kind of s- the tree was one metaphor, but another metaphor was think about a stack where at the bottom you had individual skills, technologies, systems, processes, and those got bundled together in a core competence. Right, a core competence is always it was meant to be something that was a blend and integration. That's what often made it difficult to copy. It was integration of multiple skills and disciplines, so you had all of these things feeding in from the bottom. Then you had this deep capability, and then often got translated to what we called a core product. This was an end wasn't an end product, but an intermediate product that then went into an end product and created a lot of value. I think one of the other reasons the idea kind of spread was that it actually posed a very simple, provocative question. What's our core competence, right? And so everybody's like, well, this is probably a conversation we need to have if we haven't had it already. So I ended up getting a lot of opportunity to talk to large companies and have this kind of conversation with them and help them think this through. And I remember one very well, I can probably say it now, so many years ago, but IBM was one of those companies. And at the time, IBM had a substantial division that, and again, this is my memory, so somebody can correct me if they like, but they had a large division that was making and selling computer chips, but they were selling them only inside of IBM to that went into IBM products and then through IBM's distribution channel. And I said, I think that may be a missed opportunity. And you should be selling these to anybody. And I'm like, why not? And of course, if the people running the business are kind of the marketing, the product people, they're saying, we don't want to give anybody else access to this capability. Don't want them to use our chips. And the way that makes sense, but what you're doing that is you're holding that internal capacity or competence kind of hostage to your own organization and your own products. And you might be better off if you try to drive volume and learning and investment to sell that more broadly. And so that, and I think in the end, IBM did that. And it was, I think, now where that business is today, I have no idea. This is 30 years ago. But I think this idea that you have a core product that goes into an end product, and maybe you want to sell that more broadly. And of course, that was what a lot of companies that we were tracking in Japan and other places were doing. And so, yeah, that was a bit of the genesis of thinking about those layers and how do you invest in each layer? And do you really want to only use a competence yourself? Or is it something you make as a business and you sell core products to others? So, yeah, I think many companies ask themselves that question, had never really thought about it before. How much did that change? I have no clue. I only worked with the companies I knew, but certainly the idea has stuck around, I think.
It's probably more important than ever because it's easier to jump from arena to arena in different businesses than it used to be. It's more difficult to build a competitive advantage that has a real fort around it today than it used to be. If somebody can capture this idea, they can do really well in the environment that we're in today.
I'll
Not
give you a quick example, Aidan. And again, all of these examples are products of their time. So what will the world look like in 5 or 10 years? I don't know. But obviously there's been a lot of attention on EVs over the last few years. It looks like the growth of EVs is going to plateau for a while for all kinds of reasons. Partly because the electricity grid isn't ready to take a full EV world, partly because the price of gasoline, petrol is coming down and so on. Having said that, a lot of the core competence of Tesla is around what you might think of software defined cars. So software is paramount. You get inside a Tesla, it looks like a car built around a giant smartphone, right? And it's obviously key to full self driving. Tesla's built this enormous database of all the data they've collected from their cars and so on. That's a huge challenge to German car makers and to some extent to US car makers who really haven't invested in software as a competence. And Volkswagen and others have been scrambling like hell the last few years to hire software engineers to build that capability, to understand how to get advanced software in their vehicles. This is not something you do overnight, and they recognize it might take a decade for them to catch up on that. So the argument is still there. Tesla's also vertically integrated, is building really deep competence in battery technology, and still they buy components and so on from whoever it may be, Panasonic and others, but they've really focused on building really deep expertise in these areas. Again, to some extent, you can buy that from suppliers, but not always. And so if you look at a Tesla, for example, Teslas in general, they give you more miles per kilowatt than just about any other EV because and that reflects a huge amount of deep knowledge about how to build the whole systems around this that maximize the efficiency of EVs. These capabilities are very difficult to build. And in kind of a parallel of what we saw years and years ago in Japan with the Japanese companies focusing on consumer electronics, Chinese companies have been focusing on that also deep integration, BYD, Chery, other Japanese EV makers, and building up a really strong indigenous battery industry. Now, deeply subsidized by the Chinese government, it might be added, hence the debate about tariffs for EVs in Europe and the US. But that argument is still, I think, valid. And if you're not looking forward and asking, what competencies are we going to need over the next few years? And when should we start investing there? Again, super, super hard and expensive to catch up. Can be, depending on the nature of the capability of the comp. I think you see the same thing right now in AI, the competition between Microsoft and Facebook and Google and maybe Apple and a few others, recognizing there's a lot of tacit knowledge, a lot of expertise. It takes a long time to build, and there's a real competition who's going to come out on top here.
I was writing about this, and it was partly inspired by reading your work. The idea of, for example, we talked the last day about JVC and Sony and the Betamax versus VHS wars. And tying it back to something that you said is that instead of outsourcing those capabilities, if you can find somebody who's willing to outsource the production to you, you can build capability on their dime. And I thought that was really interesting because we saw that play out with the VHS wars, and the same pattern is echoing today with the AI wars. Is that if you can get access to somebody's willingness to outsource to you, that's your opportunity. That's your sandbox to build those capabilities.
Sure, and you can have a symbiotic relationship between a smaller company and a larger company. I mean, it's quite interesting that many years ago, Microsoft used the distribution might of IBM to build the PC business. They partnered with IBM. They made the software. IBM made the boxes and sold them to companies. And you see the same thing now with startups partnering with larger companies so they can build a deep capability. And then sometimes those companies are acquired and sometimes not. So you can build a very deep proprietary relationship with a company. Maybe you don't have to build that capability in house. The other thing I would say, well, a more recent development, and I saw this even just coming back from China, and I was there as the guest of Hire. We were running a big conference on celebrating really radically managed companies from around the world, more than, I think about 70 of them. But one of the interesting things that Hire is doing, and this is also what I've argued when I worked with companies throughout the years, it's not just about thinking about what is your core competence. It's about looking at the world not as a portfolio of companies, but a portfolio of capabilities and looking deeper at, and then thinking creatively, how might we put those together? Right? What if we partner with this company or that company and we could combine? Can we do something that nobody else could do when we put those capabilities together? Well, this is taking a very practical expression now at Hire. They have a Industry 4.0, an Internet of Things platform called Cosmoplat, which would be one of the leading platforms in the world. I think GE has one, maybe Siemens has one. I think Hire is thinking more strategically and probably moving faster than anybody else in the world on this. But this is now a platform where companies with different capabilities can find each other, they can innovate together. They have an enormous database of consumer insights, and it then has a simple way of helping companies define an opportunity, contract with one another, find channels, And so you think about a lot of the innovation over the last couple of decades, and maybe we'll talk about this in another episode, has really been around one company reimagining a business model. Tesla was an example of that. Now you see, I think more and more innovation is going to come from really innovation across industry lines. Because if you want to, there's a lot of problems in the world and a lot of potential solutions that can only be realized if you bring companies, organizations together from different industries. So, for example, one of the early examples of this at Hire was reimagining the entire way China manages its blood supply. So Hire had a leg in there through deep competence in refrigeration, super advanced refrigeration that you need to do this to keep everything exactly stable and so on. But it's not only that, you need logistics, you need information, companies, IT, and so on. And so using Cosmoplat, it's quite easy-ish now to bring these organizations together, to work together, to reimagine and come up with a solution that is a multi-company, multi-player solution to very complex problems. They're doing this in automotive retailing. They're doing it across healthcare in some amazing ways. And so I would say, as an example, Hire increasingly, you're not going to see them as an appliance company. They're a company that helps industries around the world come together and solve new problems. And they get to play there. Their entree is both having that platform, which is a core competence, but also all of the knowledge they do have about refrigeration and so on, which in most of these new solutions is part of the puzzle, and you need a partner that has those deep capabilities. So I think the idea is only going to have more resonance over the next few years. And it may be less and less about who controls the customer, who controls the last mile, whatever. It's like, how valuable are your competencies to the solution? And therefore, how much profit do you extract out of the ecosystem?
There's a core thing you said, which is you need to understand the difference between core competence and non-core competence. And also core competence must make a disproportionate contribution towards customer perceived value. And you gave an example of Apple back then and the Mac as an example. So maybe we'll tell that the difference between the core and non-core, because you mentioned this, that you weren't giving people an excuse to outsource anything that was non-core.
Yeah, and things that may not be core today could be core tomorrow. In fact, against the tests that we use, and I think there were three principal ones, if I recall. One was, does it make a disproportionate contribution to customer perceived value? So is it critical in the ultimate solution? And in that sense, kind of irreplaceable. Number two, is it fairly rare and difficult to copy? And number three, can you imagine redeploying it in other ways, in other areas? And interestingly, when we were working with companies, a lot of times they probably didn't have much that you could really that meet all those three high tests. Well, that doesn't mean it couldn't become core. If you can further differentiate it, it may become core. But there are a lot of things that you need to run a business. You need call centers, you need accounting systems, you need HR that probably aren't going to be core. I mean, you still need them. They're not going to be different. And there, maybe you do outsource that thing. But again, you wanna really be careful because once you've outsourced this, it's pretty much gone. You look at the difficulty companies are having at the moment, kind of, onshoring things and rebuilding capability. Very, very, very hard to do. So, yeah, there's a lot of things that are non-core. If I thought about my own core competencies, there's things that are essential to life, breathing and eating, but I wouldn't say that's a core competence. That's just, we all do it. And, so there's a lot of things you find in a business that are necessary, but not differentiating.
Well, here's one for you. I saw this firsthand. So I retired from professional rugby. I went into a media company, and it was 2008, and people were figuring out what digital was, digital media, etc. So I was very lucky that I went in as an intern in my 30s, but I built the core competence in digital. But this was one of the problems that you said, for example, it needs to be have a disproportionate value towards the customer. But what I learned then was that it doesn't in the early days. Oftentimes, it's a fringe or an edge competence. And as you were saying, it could be like almost the nursery or the academy for the future of the company. But because it has so little value in the moment, it's often like we were saying about the tree that they pull up the roots and they throw them away. They don't even know the roots are growing, which will be the future benefit to the leaves of the tree.
You have to look at a competency not as I say, not just as a product, but you really have to think about what is the underlying problem this allows us to solve? What is the functionality? Be that mobility, be that intelligence, be that heating or cooling, and then take a very broad view about where that may be deployed. So you may have a company that has, as you say, the seeds of this deep competence. But if somebody in product marketing can't see immediately where you create a product, you may not want to continue to invest there, which is why a lot of the traditional automakers got behind in EVs, right? It was like interesting, probably going to be something, can't see how we make money out of it right now. Like, why are we investing there? So, yeah, you have to there's a whole strategic conversation there about how important will this be? How broadly could it be applied? Can we really build a position of leadership here? I think another thing that happened, Aiden, more recently is a lot of attention shifted towards kind of conversation about platforms, right? You need to have a platform. And you look at Apple iOS, that's a platform, right? Most of the companies that have platforms, built platforms, whether it's Tencent in China, Apple here, or so on, they also have very deep competencies. I don't think you find platforms where a nodal company emerges in a position of dominance, controls the platform, extracts rents from all the other players that use that platform without having some deeper capability itself. Certainly, that was true for Microsoft. MS-DOS, Windows became a platform. Many other software developers wrote on top of that platform. But Microsoft was a software leader with incredibly deep software skills and were able to therefore attract a lot of other players into their ecosystem. So I don't think platforms are ever a substitute for building your own deep competence that gives you the right to play within those ecosystems. But yeah, and I think that's what Hire's now trying to demonstrate is that, yeah, we are becoming increasingly a platform company, and the platform itself may become a deep competence in terms of building it and solving all the IP issues, all the coordination issues, the collaboration issues, huge amount of technology and thinking that goes into building one of those platforms. So a platform the underlying skills can also be a core competence, but you want to be careful separating those two conversations. What kind of platform can we build? And also what competencies are we that could be the answer to the same question, or they could be different for a particular company.
One of the things that comes to mind then is, say, for example, the Toyota and the Prius. So their huge success with the Prius is that often's missed with that is they had been looking at that, building the electric engine or the electric car for a long, long time before. And it brings to mind sometimes your strategic decisions you talked about there, that when you're too early, if you're a change maker inside an organization, you can actually lose all kind of credibility. You're right about that future coming, but you're too early, and you lose momentum and you can't connect it. Either the company gets fed up with you and press the eject button, or you sleek out of the organization because you were too early as well. I'm sure you've seen that play out many, many times.
Yeah, if you're not having a truly future focused conversation about strategy that includes the top of the company and you're building that point of view, yeah, the people who are ambitious, who see the future, who are working on cool ideas, they're going to go somewhere that's more receptive. If your organization is not thinking that way, and we'll have this conversation another point, but it's why I believe that the strategy process really always needs to be a very open and engaging conversation in a company. You've got a lot of young people in organizations who are close to the future, close to technology. They can see these opportunities way better than somebody who's in their 50s or 60s at the top of the organization. And I'll give you one example of that. I may repeat this later, but it's kind of an interesting story. I was working with a large Korean company, and we had trained. This is now probably 8, 9, 10 years ago. We had trained a lot of young people to really think about digital technology and the kinds of opportunities that might be there, particularly around social media. Very large, fairly traditional Korean company, and these young teams had generated hundreds of really cool ideas. And one team came to me and said, "Gary, we want to share something we've been working on. We think it's a cool idea." So explain it. They said, "You walk into a bar, a pub, a club, whatever it is, and you have all your social information, your profile on your smartphone. And you'll be able to see anybody else in your environment who maybe has, let's say, profile, and you can share those and match, and then maybe you want to meet this person in real life. I said, that seems like pretty interesting way of connecting. And so, to get approval for this idea, it had to run past their internal investment committee, which is mainly a bunch of late 50-year-old dudes. So we take this idea in, and the first question from the older executives there was, so if you go to a club, why are you on your phone? Right? You should just be paying attention to your friends. Now, the obviously in clubs, everybody may be on their phone, but they're all sharing it, right? But that was just like they couldn't get their answer out. And the second thing was, well, yeah, but if you meet somebody, you wouldn't want to like leave your friends and go be with like somebody else. Like, yeah, you would, and your friends are going to find this highly amusing, whatever. And so they didn't invest, right? And I think it was 6 months later that whoever it was, Mark Andreas and others, invested in Tinder, right? And here's the thing, if you have one isolated team, one young person who goes up to a senior group and says, "Here's an idea," it is super easy to shoot that idea down. Now you imagine that we had this very open strategy conversation where that idea, we shared that among the whole organization, and other people could say, "Good idea, bad idea," so on. And suddenly you find out that there's a few thousand young people who say, "This is amazing. This would really be cool. I would like to have it." Well, now suddenly, like, you have the kind of practical evidence or the confidence to say, "Hey, let's experiment with this. Let's push this forward." Whereas if it's one user looking at this thing, so you never ever want an organization in which one or just a very small group of people have veto power over new ideas. That's like just immense. That's how companies miss the future. It's just immensely dangerous.
I'm jumping ahead of my notes here because there was a brilliant line that you wrote in it was in the original HBO article. And just to explain to our audience, if you're following along with us and you're reading ahead with us, which I encourage you to do, I've taken bits from competence-based competition. That, by the way, Gary, I don't know if you know that book's €180 now. If you
Oh
have
my,
any copies lying
probably
around.
probably not worth it.
Oh, it's rare and it's unique. I've
No.
also strategic flexibility, which is a similar concept. The book is a similar concept, so we're gonna cover that. We'll just cover your chapter, your article in it as well. But there was a piece that you wrote about, which is the tyranny of the SBU, and this is your silo or your department inside an organization. And I'll quote a little piece here to bring your mind back to what you were talking about. You said, when you think about this reconceptualization of the corporation, so the idea of competencies, the primacy of the SBU, an organizational dogma for a generation, is now clearly anachronism. Where the SBU is an article of faith, resistance to the seductions of decentralization can seem heretical. In many companies, the SBU prism means that only one plane of the global competitive battle, the battle to put competitive products on the shelf today, is visible to top management. What are the costs of this distortion? Underinvestment in developing core competencies and core products. Two, imprisoned resources. As an SBU evolves, it often develops unique competencies. Typically, the people who embody this competence are seen as the sole property of the business in which they grew up. I absolutely love that. Those two things, but it's similar to what you're talking about these old dudes dismissing this concept of Tinder, that the same thing happens in an organization and everybody's siloed. So they're seeing everything from their own reward systems, their own communications, their own ownership or perceived ownership of data or skill sets or competencies, and never the twain shall meet.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the future seldom arrives perfectly aligned with your organization structure and the way you think about your business unit boundaries and so on. And that's why historically a lot of companies missed opportunities that were kind of, I think CK and I use the tape in the white spaces between, the organization chart. I mean, I think one of the old classic examples we use, kind of now moribund, what was MTV? At the time, I guess it was Columbia had there was CBS, there was a broadcast television business, and they also had a music business, Columbia Records, but they never saw the opportunity for, MTV, music TV. So, yeah, I think it's you want to be super careful that you don't see the world only through that lens. But you're and, you know, I yeah, that you're looking at this deeper question of, what holds all of this together? What's the logic for this portfolio? Where are they sharing skills? And that was just at the time a very, very rare perspective, and perhaps even today. But Ada, let me take you back to this conversation we were having about the danger of or this thought about looking at a company as a set of competencies rather than a set of products. I'll give you a very current example of how if you get that wrong, you can pay a very, very heavy price. So if you think about Intel, for years they made their own proprietary processors, x86, whatever, and that's how they thought about their manufacturing capability. We make chips with our architecture to sell under our brand, Intel Inside. Well, of course, you had Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which is now maybe worth 3 times as much as Intel, something like that, who said, no, we are going to be a foundry for anybody, right? We'll make anybody's designs, chips that go into all kinds of different products that don't have our, nobody even, the average consumer has no idea who TSMC even is. Probably 1 out of 100 would know. And yet, being able to supply so many different companies, they're learning something different from every one of those companies that feeds back into their capability development. They're creating huge scale that you can't do if it's only our end product and our manufacturing is hostage and our technology is hostage to our end product and our market. And Intel was years late into thinking about we are or were, they were a world leader in manufacturing, right? If we want to maintain that, we need volumes and a diversity of customers that we cannot supply given our particular end markets, which was mostly PCs and servers and not mobile devices. So, and I think literally as we're recording this, I believe there's a big debate now going on in Intel on whether they spin out a foundry business and how that might coexist along with their proprietary silicon business. But you don't want that competence or capability necessarily to be a hostage of your own little sliver of the market that you have. And so again, a very complex strategic question, but a very contemporary example where a company that saw itself primarily in terms of its own products and its end markets missed the opportunity to serve others and build a much stronger underlying foundation.
Great example, and I'm gonna bring it back a little bit to this article because I love the historical examples because what they show is that these are pervasive problems. These are deep embedded biases. We miss these things. They're right in front of us. We suffer from the whole idea of the cobbler's children. We're great at talking about this strategy, maybe reading about it, and then when it happens to us, we go, "Oh, I didn't see that coming." You're going, "You've been reading about this for years." So I really want to emphasize that. But you talk about this great term. You call it bounded innovation. And the way you set this up is you say, if core competencies are not recognized, individual business units will pursue only those innovation opportunities that are close at hand. Marginal product line extensions, this idea of incremental innovation, or geographic expansions. Hybrid opportunities like fax machines, you give the example of, then laptop computers, handheld televisions, or portable music keyboards will only emerge when managers take off their SBU blinkers. I thought that was a great line, and maybe you'll expand on that.
Yeah, well, I think that's this point about seeing where else in the world you can use a capability. I mean, a contemporary example, you look at Uber, where, you start out as a ride hailing service, a peer to peer kind of taxi service. But what you're really saying, and I think the founders early on said, we want to build a different kind of logistics infrastructure, right? And that we can have delivery of real time delivery of products in a neighborhood. We can deliver food, but you're not thinking about this just as like we're building a taxi business. And I think that's important. If you want to have the broadest opportunity horizon, you have to take the broadest possible conception of your business. And that's typically going to be one built on some fairly generalizable set of capabilities that you can apply across more than one market. And so if your perspective of and again, I think if your self-definition as an organization, as a business, if that self-definition is primarily in product terms, I think that's almost always wrong, right? Or let me say that differently. it's almost always partial. It's not wrong because that's you want to look at the world that way as well, but you will miss a lot of opportunities. And of course, what you've seen happen is often industries will get de-integrated when somebody figures out I can build really, really deep capabilities here and everybody will rely on it. So that was what happened to the computer industry where you ended up with Intel making the chips and Microsoft making the hardware and somebody else making Microsoft making the software, somebody else making the machines themselves. And so people started concentrating on where you can really build world-class deep capability that everybody's going to rely on. And that's not the only strategy. But you just have to take that perspective in a business. And it's dangerous if you don't. It's dangerous because somebody else is either going to build that capability deeper, faster, or going to exploit it in broader ways, which then drives investment, allows them to build it deeper. I find it very interesting, Aidan, asking, what is the core competence of a business school? Is it really great instruction? Curriculum development? Maybe. But if it is, then you want to ask, well, why aren't we making that curriculum available to the world, right? Why do we have tens of thousands of students? Why aren't we finding a way to build better curriculum, better instruction modules? But you have to ask that question, right? If you ignore it, you'll be surprised probably in an unpleasant way.
You've set us up perfectly. The pattern of I build some type of competency, I build some type of competitive advantage, I protect it then. So I get to a point of, and on an individual level as well. So this goes for professors in business schools. I have a formula that works, or I'm a consultant and I've found out a framework that works for me. I sell it over and over again. The world moves on. It's out of date, and I don't update my deck or my framework. That's one of the great benefits of doing the show, by the way. It keeps me absolutely honest to go, there's loads of new stuff out there. But you wrote this piece, and I thought this was key. When competencies become imprisoned, the people who carry the competencies do not get assigned to the most exciting opportunities, and their skills begin to atrophy. And it's only by leveraging core competencies can small companies in particular afford to compete with industry giants. So it's like use it or lose it.
Yeah, no, that's for sure true. Another good examples, if you look at Amazon and this immensely complex business of hosting suppliers from all over the world, managing logistics and the customer support around that. And if they had seen themselves, they started out as an online book retailer and then like CDs and whatever. If they'd see themselves as we're an online book retailer, like somebody else would have figured out how to do this at scale and become the online Walmart or the online Asda or whatever you want to use. And so they didn't see themselves that way. They said we have this much deeper competence that can be leveraged. And you build something that is for practical purposes, at least for the foreseeable future, unassailable. So, again, I think historical contemporary examples you can see. I mean, one of the things that drives me a little bit crazy even today is I think that US car makers suffered a lot from having this product brand myopia and neglecting a lot of the deeper capabilities. They did it for a long time around quality, and they've done it around powertrains, right? With a few exceptions. With a few exceptions, the engines in most US made vehicles really suck. They don't rev very high. They don't run very smoothly. You don't get that much horsepower per liter. And I have to say, Volkswagen and Audi have been better. Honda's been better. And there was a myopia there of these things further up the supply chain. Really, who cares about them? We just use them to put in an end product that customers are never going to really care. They're never going to notice, never see. So, yeah, you certainly want a brand and product perspective, but there are a lot of ways that can go wrong when that becomes the dominant perspective in an organization and neglect other ways of thinking about the business.
There's a couple of examples you give, Gary, again, and I'm bringing us back in time. There was the Honda one, which hasn't gone away. And as you say, core competence does not diminish with use. It actually builds like a muscle. It just gets stronger and stronger. And then you find other uses for that competence. But you give the examples of Honda and Sony. And the Sony one, for example, you focused on then was miniaturization. And I'd love you to if you cast us back to those examples. I remember the Sony just coming out with product after product. And it was, if you think about it, it was because of this core competence that they could do so. And Honda did the same, including engines for other car makers, other Chrysler, for example.
Yeah, I think it was certainly, when you're resource constrained, as those Japanese companies were back in the, 60s and 70s and 80s, and you are trying to build a solid foundation under your business, you are going to look for any example to partner with companies that can give you the funds to build that deep expertise. And so a lot of these companies did partner and they sold intermediate products and they built up volume and they built expertise in that way. So, not necessarily surprising that they did that given that they were hungry and they needed the investment and that meant partnering and kind of, if you get lucky enough, you hollow out your competitors in the process. But yeah, but that's the way they view their companies and as, a portfolio of capabilities, recognizing that that was gonna give us differentiation and that also allowed us to spread the investment there across, multiple use cases, multiple product categories. And if you're relatively small and starting out and you don't have you didn't have the volume of a Ford or a GM or a VW, that's how you build world-class competence, right? You know, and also it's why a lot of competitors dismissed, or they dismissed Honda. It was making motorcycles. But if you looked at the rate at which they were improving that technology, you could see, well, maybe they think about themselves as a motorcycle company, in which case, only Ducati or Harley Davidson needs to worry about it. Maybe they see themselves as an engine company. Then you better think about what's their trajectory versus like what's yours. And that gives you a different way of thinking about them.
The great example you mentioned there is Tesla. Tesla is an energy company. It's not a car company. Like Tesla being, for example, in insurance.
And now Tesla being in robotics, right? They've used a lot of robotics in their factories. They've made enormous investments in machine vision because Teslas do not have LiDAR and radar. They operate with cameras, machine vision. And so you say, well, where else can you use that? Right. So I mean, at one level, it's so logical, it hardly bears comment. But again, if you saw yourself as an EV maker, you don't see those other opportunities for, running battery farms that you can use to store solar energy or external power at your home or robotics. You just don't see those as opportunities. But if you understand how difficult it is to build some of these capabilities and you're looking to maximize your investment and your payoff, then this is how you think. You just think naturally about where else can I exploit this?
There's a famous interview with Steve Ballmer. It's with Charlie Rose, and he asks him about some of the great errors he made. And he said, for example, not getting into hardware earlier. And he goes, "Why didn't you?" And the way he responds is he goes, "When the name of your company is Microsoft," he goes, "We were software guys." And he said that even Paul Allen had asked Bill Gates that they get into hardware. And he said, "No, we're software guys." And they instilled it in not only into the mindset, but into the language, into the logo of the company, etc. And that's very powerful.
Yeah, well, and to be blunt, they were not only software guys, they were Windows guys. So for a long time, they missed a lot of other opportunities in software that maybe weren't accessible if what you're trying to do is sell the Windows operating system. And in fact, I believe it's historically correct. It was reported by people who were there at the time. But Apple was working on, or sorry, Microsoft was working on an iPad before Apple, and a very credible device. They showed it to a few IT journalists to get their feedback. The journalists were super impressed. And when this team went to get funding and a final sign off from Balmer, it wasn't based solely on the Windows system, just like the iPhone and the iPad don't run on Mac. They run on something purpose built for a portable environment. Microsoft engineers had done the same. And Balmer kind of went ballistic on him. He said, "What the hell? Don't you know we're the Windows company? Like, why would you bring something here that's not even Windows?" So it would have been good if they really thought about it as a software company. They didn't. They thought about themselves as the Windows company. And so anything that didn't fit that paradigm was So yeah, there are so many ways you could become myopic, but certainly that's one, right? Having this narrow kind of product focused view of who we are. Luckily, that view didn't prevail. And when we have time, I'll tell you some more interesting stories in that regard about my experience through the years of Microsoft, truly a world class company, but they also had their ups and downs. And luckily, were able to broaden their self concept and redefine themselves after about a decade of going sideways under Satya Nadella. So, you know, sometimes you see these things early enough or you have enough market power and enough resources that you can live through the process of ignoring important trends of being myopic for a decade, but a lot of companies can't.
I often think about that, like a DJ with a really bad mix. Like you can hear the beats and they're all over the place. You're kind of going, "That's a racket," and it's this intermediary transition from one phase to the next. Well, let's mention Microsoft there because I remember not long ago. I mean, this was in 2010, say, going into Microsoft, the offices here in Dublin, Ireland, and I had to bring it. I had to bring a Surface with me, and I used an iPad. I used a Mac. I had to bring a Surface, and I hid my iPhone because they were so myopic and so anti Apple back then. But it was one of the things that Nadella did, isn't it? He softened up that approach, the software that would run on the products, the compatibility, all those wars were put aside. And it's something we'll cover in the future when we talk about the alliance advantage, the other book that you wrote, what Eve does. But maybe you'll say a word on that because you saw this play out in real time.
Well, yeah. I mean, there was about a decade where Microsoft was late or missed basically every single new development. They were late to the new user interfaces that you saw with Apple, late into obviously missed the mobile phone thing, although they had a big run at it on Nokia, but kind of were very late there. They were late into the cloud, but have now made enormous strides there. They were late, initially onto the internet itself with their browser versus Netscape and so on. And in some of those cases, again, they were deeply entrenched in large corporate customers, had huge R&D budgets, and they could afford to catch up. But it was quite interesting to ask, how do you miss everything like for so many years, virtually everything? And again, it was just a very product centric view of the company. And I may have told you this story, but this was probably around 1999 or 2000. I had been asked to, I think I told you this story, but I had been asked to come make a presentation by Bill Gates to an annual CEO conference that Microsoft runs. They may still run it. And it was maybe the most intimidating audience I'd ever been in front of, like, say, maybe the World Economic Forum or something, because literally you have 100 CEOs in the room of the largest companies in the world, and you have security helicopters overhead and so on and so on. So I gave a presentation, and part of it was around thinking about the post PC world, the post personal computer world, and the fact that the PC just becomes one more device out there in the periphery, the networks at the center, and so on. And I think the talk went pretty well. But at the end of it, some person came up to me from Microsoft that was clearly a little bit exercised by all of this, some EVP, and said, Gary, at Microsoft, we don't talk about the post PC world. We talk about the PC plus world. In other words, everything will be an extrapolation or a build on what we're already doing called the PC. And I struggled for a moment to know what to say because they were clearly a little bit upset. And I finally said, well, the future is strangely indifferent to our preferences. May work out that way, may not work out that way, but that the future's not going to really care. And of course, it did turn out that way. In the same way, several years earlier, I'd given a presentation to the senior people at IBM called Information as Utility. And I couldn't say anything about cloud. I didn't know that word, but I knew like it was going to be utility, just like an electrical grid, and electricity is there. We don't all have generators. And when often the biggest advantage I have in a conversation with executives is like, I am not embedded in their internal industry thinking. I just look at it like, and sometimes that can make you seem really stupid, and sometimes you are stupid. But sometimes, occasionally, it allows you to see something that's invisible. And so I think it was very notable that one of the first things Satya did when he took over Microsoft was he disbanded the Windows division. Can you imagine? Like that is the sacred cow, the central pillar. And he said, guys, like we're hostages here. And he said, almost is almost a direct quote. He said, for far too long, we regarded Windows and the PC as the center of everything. So again, just like one more testament to the danger of thinking about just a product and becoming hostage to that point of view. And yeah, so now they're on a different path and one of the world's most valuable companies, and they are filled with like incredibly smart people, and they're look like they're going to be one of the leaders in AI, you know, but only because of their size and their oligopolistic power and whatever were they able to survive that decade.
It's like a wealthy son, for example. I'm not going to say who can afford to make mistakes with lots and lots of businesses and still be seen to succeed, but being propped
Yeah.
up by all this bank of cash in the background.
Yeah. And again, you can't be, I don't want to pick out any particular individual here because, every one of us as human beings, we're vulnerable to this, right? We're vulnerable to looking at the future through the lens of the past. We're vulnerable at kind of overvaluing what is at the expense of what could be. These are just human foibles and tendencies, and the fault doesn't lie with any particular person at Microsoft or any other company, but where the fault does lie is with organization structures or systems or ways of thinking about strategy and planning that don't really force us to work from the future backwards, that don't force us to think more deeply about, well, what is the very essence of our organization rather than a portfolio of brands and products, that doesn't force us to think about what are we delivering today? What problems are we solving? And how might those be solved in a fundamentally different way 10 years from now? And therefore, where do we invest today so we still can deliver that solution or can still solve that problem for consumers a decade now, recognizing that it may be based on a very different set of technologies or skills than it is today. So these are, really profound, deep questions. And if you don't have an organizational structure or strategy process that creates time and space and encourages people to ask those, even when they're very uncomfortable, you lose. Some kind of anti woke campaigner made this point, maybe to Gen Z, or saying, the facts don't care about your feelings. Well, the future doesn't care about your feelings either, right? It will be what it will be. And you either can think broadly and creatively about that, or, you're stuck in your silos and in your product definitions and so on, and you don't see it coming.
I love that line. The future doesn't care about your opinions or your feelings. But also, I had the great honor to do a 9-part series with the founder of Visa, D Hock. May you rest in peace. He passed away last year. But he had a great line. He said, "When's the last time evolution called up on the phone and said, 'Are you ready?'" It, evolution doesn't care. It just keeps moving on, and people cling to their old ways. That was one of the things I'm reading, preparing for Steve Kerr's book, the idea of rewards. So he wrote this book, Reward Systems: The Folly of Expecting A and Rewarding B. And
Mm.
that's a huge problem.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the reward structures are another thing that can lead to this myopia. Particularly, I would say, if you don't have outsized rewards for people who build new things. In a lot of organizations, you can do very well, you can get to the top with basically being a caretaker, right? With being an administrator, with never having to be a builder. If the big rewards go to people who are managing legacy businesses, somehow not screwing them up, like that's a problem, right? Because everybody ends up playing it very, very safe, not wanting to screw things up, not wanting to take risks. And yeah, so the reward systems absolutely can give you an entire company of careful, timid administrators who never want to be seen to screw up. So you look at a company like Hire, where if you build something new, you will participate in that equity wise. You have the chance to do extremely well. You have a lot of people wake up every day saying, how do I build something? How do I push the boundaries? If you don't have that kind of upside, or or if it's mainly reserved for people running existing businesses, then you won't have a company that's filled with entrepreneurs, bold thinkers. And again, I think most large companies are constitutionally extremely timid. And they don't need to be, right? They have the resources to experiment and try new things. If you thought about it rationally, large companies should be way more entrepreneurial and more experimental than small companies, but it doesn't turn out that way, right? So, because that timidity percolates all the way down, right? So, you may be 4 or 5 levels down and you don't want to take $100,000 risk, right? Or if you're little, you don't want to take a $50,000 risk because if you screw that up, you get dinged. So you just have timidity ingrained top to bottom. And yeah, and nobody has the incentives to really think radically different.
I had an episode a couple of weeks ago with Annie Duke, who wrote the book Thinking in Bets, and she said one of the problems that she sees is that it's the approach of risk towards a startup. If you think about a startup founder, they're expected to fail. So the hedge funds, etc., the investors are like kind of going, if it makes it great, but whatever the percentage is fails, versus a big company that the risk appetite is totally disproportionate, even though it actually can afford, like Microsoft, to go through this period of that didn't work or I missed something, etc. And it's that aspect, that view of risk. And I'd love you to, because you mentioned the business school thing. The same, Gary, for so many people you lecture to, you coach, you impart new mindsets to, that they also do this. They've built a persona inside a business and they're afraid to take risks because it'll be a blemish on their career or they'll perceive it that way. But it's actually the only way. You need to fail yourself forward.
Yeah, I mean, we all use that rhetoric about fail fast, fail cheap, fail forward, but the incentives in most organizations are not there to do that. And it's ironic because you can see at the board level where a company will do a huge multi-billion-dollar acquisition, let's say, that more often than not, those things don't pay off, but will take some huge strategic risk at the top. And somebody lower down cannot get half of their time to work on a new idea. Like it's just extraordinarily screwed up. That is the reality in so many organizations. And some organizations, historically, I guess 3M and today Intuit, some organizations and Google, whether it's still true or not, said, let's let everybody take 5% or 10 or 20% of the time to work on new ideas. So that may be a blunt way of doing it, but you need to have a system where somebody who has an interesting idea can very quickly qualify that idea with a group of peers. Is it completely fanciful or might it work? Very quickly get access to experimental funding and time to work on that, right? And so every organization needs something like that. Years ago, and I don't know in what book I might have told this story, I wrote an article, did I write that with CK? I can't remember, called Bringing Silicon Valley Inside, which I think is maybe the most, that and maybe Strategies Revolution is maybe one of the most important pieces I wrote. Because I basically made the argument that if you look at how Silicon Valley works, it works on resource attraction, right? There's not a CEO of Silicon Valley who says, let's put this much money into generative AI and this much money into cloud and this much money into biotech or whatever it may be. You have entrepreneurs who are coming up with ideas and you have a network of VCs there that are eager to find the next thing. You have thousands of employees that want to work on the next hot thing. So you basically have a market for talent, a market for new ideas, and a market for experimental capital. And it's this dance of them finding each other and funding these things and growing these things. And all these players have about 1 degree of separation between them. And now it's not only Silicon Valley that you find these clusters around the world. But there's nobody sitting at the top saying, well, I think we should put this much money here and this much money. Resources just flow. And my argument was and is it should be the same in an organization, right? If somebody, whoever they are, whatever their provenance, whatever their experience, if they have an idea that seems relatively promising to a small group of peers, enough that I can say it's probably not completely a brain fart, we need to make it super easy for that idea to attract some resources and attention. So we built, I think, what was the first kind of internal innovation market in the world for Shell in 1992, 3, I can't remember. called Game Changer, still exists. You can find it online. Now I think it's more of an external platform where they're trying to bring innovation in from around the world. But it's a very simple idea that, and again, sometimes I go, okay, I know this is a new idea. It should not be a new idea, right? Like this is like, so how can, but the idea was that every single employee should have the same access to time and money, to experimental capital as the CTO or head of R&D or somebody in the executive suite. Because I don't know where the new ideas are going to come from. And so, but what I do know is that most companies fail by overinvesting in the past. Like that I know. And so you better have a way of making it really easy for people to invest in the future, even in small increments. And you think, guys, that is so obvious. We should have internal crowdfunding and we should have things that make it easy for people to start an experiment. Still, it is not true, probably in 95% of companies. That reality just doesn't exist. We can talk about why, but it's pretty insane. It's pretty insane. And I think that's been the genius of Hire is from the start, they've said, well, from my experience with them over more than a decade, they said, we are actually building a platform for entrepreneurs. That's what our company is. And not only our own entrepreneurs, anybody out there who sees our resources, our capabilities, our network, our platform and thinks, hey, I could do something interesting with that. We want them to find us. We want to be able to invest with them. We want to be able to fund that thing. And yeah, like, why do you think this should come from startups in any case? So I think the ability to build something internally that mimics Silicon Valley, where resources flow very rapidly to new ideas, where people who are outside your company will go like, wow, you guys really have some interesting capabilities. I think I can help you do something with that. So instead, a lot of these big companies will go buy those little innovative companies, right? And then usually kill their innovative spirit like fairly quickly, rather than, well, why don't you create the right kind of culture internally so this is happening everywhere all the time?
And that's Gary, you're talking to the exact listener to this show. Those people who are inside the big behemoths trying to drive change and just so frustrated. And it's one of the reasons that this is almost like a support group, this show for those people all the time. I never told you this. This show itself actually was born out of that. I worked for the national broadcaster and I was told to come up with an idea. And it was this show, and it was rejected and rejected and rejected. And one guy who I knew, and this is the point, your point, it was only he only gave me resources because he knew me, but I had to record off company time, so I had to do it before work or after work. And then it grew so big that my own boss became corporately jealous and asked me to stop doing it. And I was like, I don't think that's a good idea. And I ended up essentially getting fired, but it was made so frustrating for me. It was like, here's a revolver and a glass of whiskey and a pen. So it was
Yeah.
made so frustrating for me, like, that I left.
And I think, it's interesting, most people who create new businesses, these are not, people's fresh out of business school with no job. These are people working somewhere else right now. So, your people are already creating the future. It's just whether they're going to do it with you or ultimately, they're going to leave because you've made it so difficult for them. But it's not that you don't have people who are capable of doing this and are eager to do it and help you grow in new ways. And if you ignore them, that's fine. They'll leave. They'll take that value with them as they go. But you're already paying them to create the future, but maybe you're not going to exploit it.
We were gonna do way more. And I was like, I've brought Gary enough on a trip down memory lane with this book as well, and it is still available online. It's expensive, it'll cost you a lot though. If you can find a secondhand copy, good luck to you. There's not very many around. But if you're reading along with this series, the next book, it's the Pièce de Resistance. It was a bestseller for many years, won lots of awards. Leading the Revolution is the book that we're going to cover next. Our guest is Gary Hamel. I'm very grateful to him for joining us, especially after his huge amount of traveling. Gary Hamel, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aidan. Always a pleasure. Look forward to continuing the conversation.
Brilliant, man. Thanks a million.